we've been spending some time, and we're going to be spending some time really centering our discussions and our conversations around the theme, the future is now. Certainly, COVID-19 has accelerated change, and the church of the future, I think, showed up more quickly for many of us than we ever could have anticipated. And so we want to have some conversations this fall about talking about culture, what we now find ourselves in, and that the future of the church has arrived very quickly. And today, what we want to do is really take sort of a 30,000 foot view and sort of look across North America a little bit. What is happening? What is taking place? What are we learning? What is discouraging? What is encouraging? And begin to ask some of those questions and try to get a 30,000 foot view. And then over the next couple of weeks, we want to begin to bring it in a little more localized to Atlantic Canada and see what God is doing here and what some of our churches will be trying and experimenting with over the coming months. So I am thrilled today to welcome J.R. Briggs back with us. You can sort of see J.R. on the screen there, many of you. He's giving you a little wave. We're thrilled to welcome J.R. back. Some of you will remember J.R. and Michael Beck from a year plus ago. J.R. and Michael were here, and we're doing some training on sort of some fresh expressions training out of the U.S. And so we were thrilled to have them here to do that. During that week, I remember he and Michael were hosted by Greg and Wendy Jones, who gave them sort of a quick tour around Atlantic Canada and around the region. And I know J.R. said they were sucked into the beauty of this region during that time. And he said to me the other day, he said, I love my country, but if they let me have another passport, I would pick a Canadian passport. So we'll see if we can talk to the Prime Minister about that and get that for you. So we're thrilled that JR is here today. He wears a pile of different hats and, spins lots of different plates. He's a trainer with Fresh Expressions US. That's how we kind of got to know him, through some Fresh Expressions training. He founded an organization called Kairos Partnerships that really cheerleads, works with, consults, encourages pastors across North America. In fact, he was working with a team this morning in Quebec in Canada. So this is Canada Day on Wednesday for JR. He teaches at Missio Seminary, teaches at Friends University, other universities. He's working with the Ecclesia Network in the U.S. as well. He's a writer, has just written a new book. He's going to tell you a little bit. I'm going to give him an opportunity to plug that a little bit later and share something with us about that. And so he comes to us spinning a lot of different plates with a lot of different experience and understands some of our Canadian culture because he works with leaders all across our country. So that's a little bit about JR. I think probably most importantly, he is a dad to Carter and Bennett. He's a husband to Megan, and that probably, he would say, I'm sure, is his biggest claim to fame. So all the other stuff is good, but that stuff is the best. And so we know that he's he's a dad and a husband and loves his family. So JR, with all of that said, we're thrilled that you're here today. We really appreciate you taking some time with us. And because that's what Atlantic Canadians do, before we jump into the conversation, maybe I'll just give you a minute just to say hi and just bring some greetings because that's what we do around here. So jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Kevin. It's so good to be with you and to connect with you again, my friend. And I am so encouraged, even in these first few minutes, about the way in which you and other CBAC leaders are resourcing the church. So I just say, go for it, keep going, you and the team there, which is fantastic. And so thanks for what you do. And I want to thank all the pastors out there because this has been an intense stretch. And so I just want to say thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for getting out of bed on those days where you just don't want to get out of bed because it's too hard and too intense. So I just want to say thanks. And I carry some of that burden with you and feeling some of that exhaustion and some of that uncertainty and maybe even insecurity in this season because it's so uncertain. So I do want to say this. I mentioned this when I was there a year ago in May in Atlantic Canada, and I mentioned this to Kevin on an earlier call a few weeks ago. I know the dirty little secret about Canada, and that's that you aren't huge fans of American imports, and so I understand that, and so I want to be very, very careful that I'm sharing from my own perspective, but that you hear, by all means, please contextualize what I'm saying for your area and for the mission of the gospel. So if it's helpful, great. If not, just disregard what's not and keep what is. As I'm sharing with you, do it like you would eat seafood. You eat the meat and throw out the bones, and you get to decide what's meat and what's bones, not me. So you are the expert of your context, not me. So the last thing I want to do is just bring in another American import into Canada. What I want to do is just kind of offer some thoughts and perspective, and then trust you in the great work that you're doing to be able to contextualize it within your context. But it's good to be with you. And Kevin, thanks for this opportunity today.
And JR, I mean, that's why you're back, buddy, because that's the posture that you take. And we do love our American brothers and sisters, and we've really appreciated you. So, and I would say, JR said to me, and if he says something today where you go, I don't know, I'm not sure about that, then please jump into the chat or raise your hand. We'd love, this would be best if we can dialogue that way a little bit and all learn from each other. So please, don't hesitate to jump in that way. I know he said to me, he's more than open to that, wants to learn from us, and we're going to learn a little bit from him. So let me, JR, just start kind of this way and just say, you do have some perspective across North America. You're in the US and Virginia. You have a good sense of what's taking place in your country. You're in Quebec this morning. You're in Atlantic, Canada this afternoon. I know you've been out west as well, working with some churches out there. So, what are you hearing? What are you seeing as you look and hear across North America as we kind of navigate our way through this COVID-19 chapter? So what is discouraging? What is encouraging? What are we learning during this chapter, JR?
Let me start with the hard stuff, the discouraging things that I'm seeing across the country, and then we'll move to what's more encouraging. No surprise, what's discouraging is the amount of exhaustion. So I'm hearing I'm exhausted. I'm hearing from pastors, I'm disoriented. Recent poll through the Barna organization recently here, at least among American pastors, they were asked, how many of you feel understood in this season that we're going through? And among pastors, only 1% said they felt understood by their congregation. I think that's huge. And that's incredibly discouraging to be able to hear that. What's also discouraging are how many pastors that feel they're in a double bind, that no matter what decision they make, that they're upsetting half of their church. Do we open now? The other half is mad. We wait. The other half is mad. It's just so divisive and polarizing, at least and here in America, in the United States. But I know that in North America, the Canadians that I've worked with feel a lot of the same things, but just in different expressions or different extremes. I'm concerned about burnout. Pastors don't know how long this is going to last, which makes it the hardest of all. I mean, if you were asked to get up and just run a race and say it's going to be 10K, and when you're done, you can rest, that's great. But it's as if pastors are saying, I think I'm running a 10K, but I could get done. And people say, lace them up, now run another 20K. Well, that's really exhausting. And so I'm concerned about burnout. I think the first several months there's been adrenaline, and we're all, but after a while we're getting worn down. That adrenaline is starting to wear off. I'm concerned over the next several months about the margin or the lack thereof among pastors. So that's discouraging what I'm seeing, but encouraging. And there's a lot of encouraging things. Before COVID, when it came to experimentation and thinking about the church outside the walls of the church, we were in a get-to situation. Yeah, we could think about ways of thinking differently, or we could think about maybe pivoting, but during this is a have-to situation. We have to do that. We have no choice. And in many ways, necessity is the mother of innovation. And so we're not in a get-to situation. We have to figure this out. And so many pastors are committing to not wasting a pandemic, that it's too big. And we think that God believes it's too big for us to waste it. So those are some encouraging things. What are pastors learning? Well, I'm deeply grateful that there's a lot of unlearning that's going on. In fact, maybe the greatest thing that I've seen with pastors is unlearning some old ways or old models or old approaches, some old wineskins that with the new wine, they just don't work holding the new wine with these old wineskins anymore. But as far as learning, I think I've seen 5 specific areas. Number one, that if there's ever a time to experiment, now is the time. Now is the time to do it. And I think people are really grasping onto that. Number 2, that the key word in this season is resilience. And I really believe, we have a theology of resilience in the church. And so I really think, what does it mean for us to be resilient people following a resilient God, where we're given a resilient theology? And I think that's going to be helpful. That's one of the reasons, one of the two podcasts I host, one of them is called the Resilient Leaders Podcast, because I do believe in this season that this idea of resiliency is so crucial. So that's number two. Number three is that there's a deeper desperation and dependence upon God. This feeling among pastors, God, if you don't come through right now, we're through. And the truth is, we should have had that all along, but I think we're being pushed, even though there's burnout and stress and struggle. I do think there's a saying, I can't do this in my own power anymore. I've tried and I can't. And so I think that deeper desperation and dependence upon God is a wonderful thing. I hope it continues. I hope we don't get settled into some sort of new reality or new normal where we just kind of push that back out again. But I hope we just remain in that desperation. Number four, I think we're wrestling with ecclesiology in ways we've never wrestled with before. We're asking questions like, can church be done online? Can we do it in a park? Can we do it outside of our building? Can we do this in people's homes? How do we do communion? What does mission and evangelism look like digitally? So I think we're really asking some good ecclesiological questions we wouldn't have asked before, and having to wrestle through that of how do we use technology appropriately without it impeding upon the importance of incarnational ministry, of just being face to face with people. And then lastly, I think what we're learning, or what's being reinforced, is that discipleship is king. And I think that's incredibly important. If I could, there's a quote by Neil Cole out of his book, Ordinary Hero. And he said this, he said, ultimately, each church will be evaluated by just one thing: its disciples. Your church is only as good as her disciples. It does not matter how good your praise, your preaching, your programs, or your property are. If your disciples are passive, needy, consumeristic, and not radically obedient, your church is not good. And I've used that quote multiple times here because I really do believe that discipleship is king in this season. So yeah, so those are the five things I'm noticing. I think that we're all learning together. Some of that's encouraging, some of that's discouraging, but those are some themes.
I mean, that's worth the session right there, JR. I mean, I think you alluded to it and said someone said, never waste a good crisis.
Yeah.
And I think those five that you just laid out, we could take the rest of the session and not get through those five if we just had conversations about those. But I think you've really summed up some really important things that we're going to need to wrestle with moving forward, across the continent. So let's move from that and just ask the question. I mean, as we've said, the future arrived. We've more quickly than we could have thought. We've been pushed, as you just said, into this sort of forced experimentation. Now we have to do it. Those entrepreneurs that are sort of wired that way just love that because they've been looking for that opportunity. Those that are, not wired that way are like, oh my goodness, what, I don't want to have to do this. So, I mean, that's a lot just based on personality and giftedness and what we enjoy. But I think COVID in some ways is sort of shaking us out of our slumber to say, listen, everybody, this culture that has arrived on your doorstep has been here for a while now. And now this is waking us up to a brand new day. What are some of the, if I can ask, what are some of the new trends that you are seeing? Some new awakenings, perhaps, maybe some movements that are starting. As you look out, what is exciting you in terms of maybe trends or movements or kingdom opportunity that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, I must admit, I've got a very unpopular opinion or conviction about this, but I do believe that COVID has been a gift for much of the church.
So, yeah.
Because it has pushed us out of our comfort zone so that we can't rest on our heritage or our history or the good old days or our budgets, those things in the past maybe that have been there. So we've been forced to learn and be humble and to deepen our trust in Christ. I'm not one for trends. I mean, I think I know what you're asking, but I'm always scanning the environment for new opportunities or openings or patterns, even gaps. And I do believe that there is a movement underway for the church to wake up and to capture this. And if I can use one of your own sociologists, religion sociologist Reginald Bibby, and he said, people are aren't leaving their churches, they just aren't going to them. And I think that's really important because we look around and go, 60% of the people that were here a year ago aren't here anymore because of COVID. Well, people are still identifying themselves by going to church or a particular church. They're just not attending to them right now. And I think that's a weird liminal space for pastors to live in right now. But to realize people haven't given up on the church, they just aren't going to them. At least what Reginald Bibby has found. Anger and those heart theological questions about the church are not the biggest problems. I mean, they're not ticked off at church right now. Most people are not at church on Sunday. They're at home. They're not seething with anger about the church. Instead, they're sleeping, they're grocery shopping, they're knitting, skiing, working out. So I think sometimes it can be easy to think, oh, everybody hates the church and everybody. It's just that they've found other things to fill their time. At least in a lot of parts of North America, there's more of a shoulder shrug of, church is fine. It's just not high on the priority list. And so that's a big trend that we're beginning to see in the midst of this. But back to your question, I'm very passionate about this question. I'm a week away from submitting the manuscript to my next book to my editor on this very topic. But I think that we've experienced a collective PTSD around the globe through this experience. And there's a quote by Mr. Rogers, the childhood, the children's television star who passed away a handful of years ago. But he said, when I was little, my mother used to say to me, when you see scary things, look for the helpers. Now, we've seen scary things around the world, and in all due respect to Mr. Rogers' mother, I think as we've seen scary things, the world is not just looking for helpers, the world is looking for healers. And so this is a theme that's been in high def Technicolor for me, high def for the last 6, 7, 8 months or so. But this idea, I think back to the story in Numbers 21, that weird story about the snakes, being released on the desert floor, and God tells Moses, raise up a bronze snake and people who look to it will be healed. I mean, that's kind of a weird story. It seems a little bit obscure, but we know John 3:16. We don't often know John 3:14 and 15, the two verses right before the famous New Testament verse. Jesus is with Nicodemus, and he said, just as Moses raised up a snake in the wilderness, I myself will be raised up. That Jesus basically says, I'm going to be the snake raised up on a pole, that cross, that anyone who looks to me will be healed. And I think right now the world is looking for healers. And I think that number one trend or pattern we need to pay attention to, even that Greek word sozo, S-O-Z-O, right? It means to heal, to save, and deliver. And so those can be used interchangeably. We know that Jesus saves, at least here in North America. That's on a lot of billboards. Down here in America, that's on a lot of church marquees. And sometimes there's a collective like, yeah, okay, Jesus saves. But that same word, sozo, to save or to deliver, also means to heal. And I wonder, not changing theology, but changing the emphasis, like a gem that we just turn and it refracts a little bit of different light off the facet. What if it's the same sozo Jesus, but we turn the gem a little bit and it's now Jesus heals? There's been so much pain that the world has experienced, and a clearer picture that the church is here to be a field hospital for those who are wounded, I think is the most important thing the church can pay attention to. So I think of the story in John 5, where Jesus meets the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda, and he says, do you want to get well? I think that's the question that humbly and yet confidently we need to ask and show the world, do you want to get well? The late Catholic priest Henry Nouwen wrote a book years ago called The Wounded Healer. And I think that language is very good right now because Jesus is our wounded healer, right? He still had scars on his resurrected body. And right now, we have scars all over us. And it's our job in the name of Jesus to point people to the great wounded healer in this season. Because that's the shared collective PTSD right now. We've all been wounded, big or small. It could be financial, it could be physical, it could be relational. Abuse is up, addiction is up, suicide attempts are up. There's a wounded world. And I think this is the ripe opportunity for the church to say, will we step in the gap and help people heal? That's the big trend. So that's why I'm very passionate about it, Kevin.
That's so, I mean, I grew up and they often would say, the evangelistic crusades, when we had our Southern Baptists come up and have crusades years ago, the ground is level at the foot of the cross, right?
Yeah.
And I believe that that's true. And I think this chapter has leveled other ground as well. And we all now are in that place of some healing. I mean, I've been saying the unpopular thing with you that COVID is a gift, and I've had to balance that because that can be
Yeah.
misunderstood, right? It can be
Absolutely.
misunderstood because
Absolutely.
it has brought an awful lot of pain and dysfunction
Yeah.
and hurt and grief with it. But the gift is it's opening our eyes, and maybe the ground has been leveled for all of us to need some healing. And
Yeah.
for us as the church to be able to say, we serve the one healer that can
Yeah.
bring healing to all of us. Maybe that is the biggest open window for us for this next chapter, to position ourselves in such a way to be that place of healing for those that don't know where to turn. They don't know where to turn.
Exactly. And that is, and this isn't something that when we have a vaccine or whenever this goes away, I mean, this is years of repair. This is
Yeah.
years of healing that will have to happen. The amount of damage that has already occurred, even if it changed tomorrow, just the amount of repair and healing that will exist. So if pastors can just see through the lens of healing, this will be really helpful. I mean, even just reading scripture through the lens of realizing the scriptures were written to a group of oppressed, wounded, and traumatized people.
Yeah.
There's almost every audience in scripture
Yeah.
is to a group of oppressed, wounded, traumatized people. That's the good news. So in a world that's been traumatized and wounded, how can the scriptures then be reinvigorated to a world that says, I need this? This is really, really good news. So yeah, whether that's physical healing, economic healing, emotional, mental healing, there's just so much available to us here in the United States. Back in the early parts of the pandemic, everyone was saying, our medical first responders, they're our heroes, right? So everyone's throwing around the heroes word. Well, what does it look like for us to rally around them, but also others who are in the quote unquote healing business?
Yeah.
And so that's the gospel, right? My sin sick world, like I have contracted the virus of sin and I need a vaccine. And it's the good news of Jesus. Only the blood of Jesus becomes the vaccine of which I truly can live. If I look to the snake on the cross, I will be healed. And
Yeah.
so that becomes the very thing of realizing that Jesus wore a corona of thorns on his head,
Right.
to take on our sin sick virus. That's the good news moving forward.
That's a strong theological word, but that's also a strong, very practical word in
Yeah.
terms of where this can help direct us as the church. Let me move down a little bit of another sort of another practical road. My sense is that because of this chapter, there's a window that is open to us, that the window is going to probably close more quickly perhaps than we would even anticipate. We've been forced to reimagine, how do we do church? How do we be church? And there's been this forced experimentation. The tendency for a lot of us will be, when COVID-19 passes, the tendency for many of us will be just to kind of slip back into what we know because it's comfortable, because we can do it. We don't have to think a whole lot about it. And the tendency will be to slip back there. So take a minute, if you would. Speak to those of us who want to be a little bit visionary about the future. Speak to us, for those on this call that really want to resist that. They see this opportunity. Do you envision a model of church or a way of doing church that might be a little bit different than what our experience has been? Our experience is Sunday morning, rows of pews, 3 hymns and a poem, talk at me for 30 minutes and then send me home. And I think we're seeing, online church has turned that upside down. I think we've seen some move towards some home church and house church and dinner church that is turning that upside down. So do you have a sense of where maybe the church might be moving in terms of potential new models of ministry, JR?
It's a time of wet cement right now, for sure. And so we need to realize that that's the case. And if there ever is a time, as I mentioned, to experiment, now is the time. There is permission to do so. I'm not sure what it is in Canada, but in the United States, everyone loves to keep using this phrase, when we get back to normal or the new normal. I have to share with you, honestly, I hate that phrase, the new normal. Instead, I'm using the phrase, the new reality. And I think why that's helpful is when we think new normal, it's often when we get back to what we knew in the past. And there will be some things, of course, that will be familiar. but I really want us to be focusing on the present and the future. And so that's why I think a new reality helps frame that, to think a little bit more forward than new normal, kind of looking backwards. So the quicker we can understand that we aren't going back to normal, the better. And the quicker that we can help our people understand that in our churches, the better. And so instead of the new normal, using the new reality, when I coach and work with leaders, I'm basically trying to give them 4 different lenses of which to look through: the now reality, the next reality, the new reality, and the eternal reality. So the now reality for pastors and for congregants is simply to say, what do I need? What needs to get done in the next 24 to 48 hours? I mean, so much is changing, but what do I need to do before my head hits the pillow tonight? What do I need to steward that God has entrusted to me today on this date? And then the next reality would be a few days or a couple weeks out, right? So say, okay, Sunday's coming in a little bit. We've got our next teaching series for the next 2 or 3 weeks. But the new reality is kind of what happens a couple months to a couple years out. That we kind of know, hey, maybe our budgets are going to be lower than we expect, and maybe in terms of church attendance, it may not bounce back as quickly as we wanted or what we think. So what is the new reality over the next 2 months to, let's say, 2 years? And then, of course, the eternal reality is like, in light of eternity, how does all I think through that lens, how does that impact what I do, how I lead, how I minister, even what I don't do? And so I find that sometimes where people get overwhelmed is they think everything has to be in the now reality. Like, I've got to figure out everything out. I've got to boil the ocean by tomorrow morning. And no, we don't. And so what needs to get done today? What needs to happen over the next few weeks? And then what needs to happen over the next several months or a few years? So I think that's helpful for pastors who are trying to think through, do I change the model tomorrow? Do I go radical and just mix everything up? Or do I tweak a few things? Do we throw a few things against the wall and experiment and see what sticks? So the world is changing, and leaders are certainly called to help lead in that change. But what we don't like, and what we absolutely need, is that we ourselves need to change in the process. And I think it's very tempting for us as leaders and churches to say, the models need to change, you all need to change, and not remember that for leadership, it has to start with us. And we don't like that, because that's the crucible of change happens inside of here. And the hardest person we will ever lead will always be ourselves. And so participation, there has to be participation in safe places and spaces for people to ask questions, including us as the leader. I think in this season, regardless of different models, participation equals value. If people are participating in the present and the future of the church, they're going to find value in it. But if they're simply expecting you as the pastor to do it all while I sit back and wait to see what you decide, that's not helpful. So participation equals value in this season. We preach about the priesthood of all believers. I think now is the time to actually practice it and actually put it out. So as far as models, I really do believe that smaller means more participation. And so what we're seeing, instead of large gatherings, some of it because of our governmental jurisdictions and laws and policies that have been put in place, don't even allow for large gatherings over the last several months, but smaller means more participation. So if we can think many smaller groups rather than little large groups, that's going to be really helpful. So that will require some paradigm shifts. And again, pastors assume everyone else will change. Pastors, we need to be doing the changing ourselves first. The second paradigm shift is that, pastor, you do it all for me. But now seeing ourselves as pastors as equippers. My job is to equip you, like Ephesians 4 says, to help you go do the work of the people as the people of God. And then the other thing I think we need to really shift in our paradigm is that we as pastors assume that these will be small temporary tweaks and changes, when really we need to shift to thinking that we're in new territory. And so I think we need all kinds of models for all kinds of people and all kinds of churches. So what I don't want to do is say, this is the only way to do it and everything else you're wrong. Right. But I want us to see this as a fleet of ships rather than one aircraft carrier. We need dinghies, we need battleships, we need submarines, we need sailboats, and we need aircraft carriers. We need them all traveling together in the water. So I just would want to encourage pastors, see where there's growth, on the edges, pay attention to that, and then let's be able to lean into that a little bit more with experimentation. And I keep going back to that word, Kevin, because if we try a new initiative or a new project and it fails, oh, you're such a failure, it didn't work. But if you use the word kingdom experiment, we love that phrase, because what happens to experiments? A lot of them don't work. Okay, what did we learn from that? Let's learn. What is God up to? Maybe we take part of that and try it in a different expression over here. But when I look at the book of Acts, it looks like nothing more than following the Spirit and engaging in kingdom experiments. I think we can do the same here in this season.
That's so good. I mean, when I was pastoring, and even now, I used to call everything a pilot project. Everything's a pilot
there you
project,
go.
right?
Good.
Because if it doesn't work, it's it was just a pilot project. If it does work, nobody even remembers it was a pilot project, and you just keep doing it, right? And so
it's beta form right now.
It's experimentation, and I love your point. I think this is what we're experiencing here. That there's the participation, the value participation, and the value of small. I've been saying to pastors across this region, Atlantic Canada is built for small. I mean, we are small. I mean, we love small. We don't like big. We love small. And so I think we may be built really for this next chapter of whatever some of this looks like. Let's just, and I appreciate all that you've said, and that there's going to be all kinds of models, and we need all kinds of ships. Your family, however, has been involved in your church in a very different type of model, and a very different type of church experience than what some of us have experienced. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and feel free to interrupt if you want me to add more details or keep moving. But I planted a church here in the Philadelphia area about 13 years ago, and I envisioned during church planner training, it would be rent out a school auditorium, stand up front, 3 songs, preach, communion, pray, benediction, go home. And it was in the midst of wrestling with our team, our core launch team, that we began to say, what is the point of a Sunday morning service? We know it's important. Let's be really clear about it. And after a month of wrestling with our team, we came down to the phrase formation for mission, that we're shaped in order to be sent. That's what this is about in its various expressions, but formation for mission. And then someone raised their hand in the back and said, so I have a question. If it's formation for mission, can't we be that? But do we have to be that all the same at the same time under the same roof? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, can we do formation for mission in smaller groupings in different expressions? And so what resulted from that conversation was we have a very unique model here in the US, in that we meet on the first and the third Sundays. Our entire church comes together like you would have a typical, Sunday morning gathering in most churches. But on the second and fourth Sundays, we meet in geographically based micro communities of what we call house churches that meet in houses that are led by trained leaders or some of our elders to do the same thing we do in big church, but we just do it in people's homes. And so we kind of have this DNA of big, small in a given month. At first we thought we were crazy. We'd never seen anybody else do this kind of model, but we've lived by the mantra that structure must always submit to the Spirit. And we sensed the Spirit was in this. So we said, we're going to submit to this. And so we said, let's try it. And we will do this until our elders and our leaders together discern from the Spirit that we need to do something differently. 13 years later, we're still doing it. And Kevin, I think I was joking with you a few weeks ago. Sometimes people say, like, why would you do that? Like, that's weird. Why don't you just do what everybody else does? We even had some well-meaning people say, hey, no offense, but are you guys a cult? We said, no, we're not a cult. We stopped sacrificing cats 6 months ago. We're good. And so we basically have been in this model, but then the pandemic hits. And Kevin, 3 or 4 calls a week of churches saying, how do we do what you're doing? And so now our church, after having to apologize or rationalize or justify or explain, yet at the same time, now people are saying, we need to do it, teach us. And so we're getting a chance to steward now what God has had us experience over the last little bit. So that allows us to be big and small at the same time. And We're not sure if we're one church with little house churches or if we're a network of house churches that come together for a family reunion twice a month. We're not sure. And we're okay with that, but we double major in that. One is not more important than the other. House churches and our gatherings are of equal importance in our structure.
That's so good. And maybe I don't think we talked about this, but let me ask this, because in the house church movement, I think there's a bit of a tendency, a bit of a fade towards in becoming ingrown a little bit. There
Yes.
can be. That's a risk. So how do you keep the sort of the evangelistic fire burning? Are you finding that those groups are maintaining an openness, that new people are coming? What's your experience with that?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we talk often about this idea of inward, outward, and upward. In, out, and up, I know, is language that a lot of churches use. Sometimes they use a pyramid. We actually use 3 circles, and we find that the 3 circles to be really helpful. And so those 3 circles of inward, outward, and upward really keep us focused on what we sense God is up to. And so we're constantly asking others, where are we in that? Where are we strong at? Is it more the inward? Is it more the outward? Or is it more in the upward dimension? And where might we need to adjust or move? Just in the midst of this, in August and in September, where in the northeast part of the U.S., we've been hit hard by COVID. We did 2 baptism services, total of 8 people coming to faith, new people coming to our house churches right now. So we're really grateful for what the Lord is doing in terms of bringing about some new changes, and we just say, yay God, thank you for that. So we just want to steward what that is. And if it's all right, Kevin, I think I can show you just a quick chart here. I think I have sharing capabilities. Maybe you can see
there it
this
is
here.
Yep.
And so for us, we use this 3 centered Venn diagram here. Most churches are 2 out of 3. Very few churches are 1 out of 3, but only a few churches are 3 out of 3. And this is by Thomas Willer, who is out of Copenhagen. And he talks about this. And so sometimes with our elders, we'll just say, where do we think we are right now? And then where do we sense we need to really put the blowtorch of focus and raise the temperature, raise the heat, so that we move into that. So for us, this is how we stay centered. This is how we measure health in what we're doing. And most churches, I think in the US context, the vast majority of churches are in that sectaric closed category, where there's an upward dimension of worship, but there's an inward dimension, not just my own soul, but we take care of ourselves and our people. And so there's a little bit of a huddle and cuddle posture that can occur in that. And so a lot of this is saying, how do we move towards an outward expression, and so that we can move into more of a discipling culture, because we're betting the farm on discipleship in what we're doing. And we believe the best way discipleship is expressed is in upward, our worship, inward, community and communion with God, but also outward in terms of mission and how we're serving beyond ourselves.
That's really good. That's really good. I mean, we can't follow this road a whole lot more right now, but I'm sure there may be lots of questions, and maybe if people want to stay on in the Q&A, they might even want you to flesh out a little bit more some of that. So that would probably be good for our next little session together. And I forgot to mention, maybe Ron, I'll get you to throw that link into the chat of JR's blog. We sort of had sent that out early as well. Some of you might have seen it, sort of a blog talking about sort of the distributed church, and we'll throw it into the chat again, just in case you haven't seen it. And in the last before we do kind of wind things up, if you were pastoring back in the church, back pastoring again, just speak to the pastors here. I guess first, just generally, if you're leading a church at this point in history, what would you be doing? What would you be focusing on? Help me navigate what I need to be doing right now. Any counsel, JR, for anybody?
Yeah. Well, we cannot lose our first love. And I would just say, more than anything, make sure that we are abiding in the vine, John 15, 1-8. And I think we just, as pastors, we can spend so much time doing things for God that we actually forget to spend time with him. And that becomes an adage, but it's true. And so we need to make sure that we have a throbbing with life, relationship, and intimacy with Christ, no matter what. We know that, right? I mean, but we are educated beyond our level of obedience.
Right.
And so we have to be very careful that we just say, oh yeah, I'm supposed to have a relationship with God and cultivate that daily. That's really important, number one. Number two, I would just encourage people to think like a missionary. So if God called you to be a missionary in Zambia, or called everyone in your church to pick up, sell everything and move to Zambia, what would you do in order to connect with the people of Zambia? Well, you'd probably want to learn the language, the customs, the culture, the food, to listen really well, to understand some of those cultural dynamics, to know what they celebrate, to mourn what they mourn. Well, I think this is the season right now that we're not going to Zambia, but we're going to Atlantic Canada, where we already are. So how can we take that same mindset that if we went to Zambia, of thinking we're missionaries in our own backyard and in this context? That's what I would do. And then lastly, I've already touched on this, but the idea of healing, that John 5 question, do you want to get well? And I think you can do an asset-based assessment of your own church to say, who are our social workers? How about those that work in the mental health field every day? What are ways that I can equip them to be missionaries cleverly disguised as social workers and mental health advocates? And so there's that. How about, business people within the church to say, hey, can you help people who've been ravaged by this? Can you help them put a resume together as they've been unemployed? So I think in this season, that's what I would really want to encourage people to do. Cultivate a journey with Jesus every day. We have to make this our top priority more than normal. Number two, think like missionaries in our own context. And number three, how can we do asset-based assessment of our own congregation of, Lord, who have you brought to us? How do we care for them? But how do we equip them to be healers in the name of Jesus out in the world? That's where I would start with those. That's three.
Awesome. No, really helpful. I want you to share a little bit about a couple of the resources that you have. I've been working with a team of CBAC pastors, and we're going to launch a new resource in the new year. And it's really about helping churches process, if we were to start something, if we were to launch something, if we were able to get a sense of what God is up to in our neighborhood and maybe launch a new kind of church or a new kind of congregation, whatever that could look like. And so we're putting together a 14-week process which has phase 1 and phase 2. And those of you on the call, we're going to be putting lots more information out about that in the next month or two. So you'll be hearing about that. One of the things that was interesting to me, and I downloaded it, was the recent resource that you put together with Fresh Expressions US in terms of house churches. Very practical, very helpful. I think if some of our churches begin to move towards sort of dinner church, house church, cafe church, whatever, that could be a really, really helpful piece, a resource for them in their conversations. You want to just talk a little bit about that and sort of whet people's appetite on that, J.R.?
Yeah. So for some of you who are trying to think a little bit smaller, this is where this can be of help to you. Through the organization, as Kevin mentioned, Fresh Expressions, and you can find that at freshexpressionsus.org. And certainly, I know there's a Fresh Expressions Canada chapter as well that we work with on occasion. But freshexpressionsus.org, and there's a resource there on how do we mobilize our churches to think like house churches. Some people are doing that temporarily, like just through the pandemic. That's great. Right. But some people are saying, actually, this makes a lot of sense for us to do this permanently. Let's do this permanently. And so you can find out more information at freshexpressionsus.org. And there's a free app that you can download called the FX Connect app. And it's through that app that you can actually have access to the, you can purchase and download the cohort, the curriculum, along with resources and slides and other additional videos, if that's of interest to you.
Yeah, so you can go to wherever you get your apps, FX Connect. It's a really helpful app. They're sending out information and resources all the time. And the resource that JR put together is a really helpful one, very practical in terms of thinking through some of the issues of house churches. Tell us about your book, just released.
Yeah, just came out last month, called The Sacred Overlap, Learning to Live Faithfully in the Space Between. We find ourselves, I'm a big Venn diagram fan. I already showed you a Venn diagram, but I'm a huge Venn diagram fan. And so this idea where we often live in this either or world, and your southern neighbors here are having an election here in just a few weeks. And so we're experiencing incredible division. And so many churches and pastors are saying, what do we do now? often, Jesus is the great either or, no doubt about it, right? Light or darkness, life or death. But once we follow Jesus, it can make us really uncomfortable when we read in our Bibles, especially the Gospels, how Jesus lived in a lot of this both and tension.
Right.
And he did it so beautifully. And so we see, the lion and the lamb, worship in spirit and in truth. He was full of justice and mercy. He said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. So how do we join God in that sacred overlap of this Venn diagram instead of either or, but the both and? And so that's what the book is about. And yeah, if anybody's interested, you can pick that up wherever fine books are sold.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, that's really cool. We're going to kind of tidy it up and move to some Q&A time, but just to close, anything else that's kind of burning in your heart that you sort of say, I can't not close this without sharing this? There may be nothing, but is there anything that you'd say, just let me leave you with this one burning thought?
Yeah, well, there's been some new learning in my own life recently. I'm learning a great deal about joy. And if my family were here, they would probably chuckle right now because joy does not come naturally to me. They would say I'm not always a joyful person. But I'm just doing this deep dive study on what is joy. And one of the things that I've found is I thought I knew what joy was, and I'm learning I actually am learning for the first time what joy actually is.
Wow.
And so I'm just really encouraged by that. And I would want to encourage you all to press into what is joy really, and to encourage us to not lose joy. Don't lose your joy in this tough situation. Joy and I'm not talking, just jump around and pretend everything's okay. But even with tears in our eyes, we could still have joy. And I just want to encourage all of us that joy may be the greatest evangelistic opportunity for us in the midst of all the woundedness that we've experienced in the world. And don't lose your joy. Don't lose your joy, no matter what it takes. So that's what I want to leave.
That's a great word study in the middle of a pandemic. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very, very cool. Thanks for that. We're gonna kind of tidy it up. I just want to say on behalf of all on the call, just thanks so much, JR, for, you've given us gold all the way through here. So many great little nuggets, things that I know people are writing down. So we appreciate you. We appreciate the friendship, the relationship that we have with you, with, Fresh Expressions US, all those different organizations. And we really have appreciated you. So I'd say to everyone else on the call, we're going to be back in a couple of weeks again. At that time, we're going to sort of bring it in a little bit. I've got a couple of pastors from a couple of our sort of significant churches across Atlantic Canada that both are sort of working within that traditional model of church, but they're really beginning to think about shifting some pretty significant gears and moving and doing some very, very, very different things over the coming months. And so I think it would just be really helpful for us just to listen to them and hear what they're thinking, talk to them, question them, dream with them a little bit about what God is doing in their midst. And maybe some of us can learn from some of the creativity that's taking place in different parts of the region. So that's going to be in 2 weeks. They're going to come and share sort of their story. And we're just going to have a great conversation about where they feel their church is maybe going, where God is leading them in this next chapter. So hopefully that's a bit of a teaser that will sort of scratch an itch for some of you, and that you'll be back again in a couple of weeks.